Hello, students. This is actually intended to be part two of the American Expansion recorded lecture, but it's actually part three. When I was recording part one, I used Screencastify to make my recorded lectures, and anyway, I wasn't logged in. It was going to not record the video, so I had to X out real quick. So I came back and did the rest of that part in the part two. So this is actually part three, but really meant to be part two of the American Expansion recorded lectures. So this part we'll be talking about the Spanish-American War, the effects of it, and the Philippine insurrection. And then part three, or really part four, we'll be talking about foreign policies for three different presidents: Teddy Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. So at the end of the last part, I talked about social Darwinism. Really, social Darwinism tremendously influenced a lot of the Europeans' mindsets in wanting to expand, particularly carve up Africa or different parts of Asia and try to carve up China into spheres of influence. It did influence American diplomacy as well. And so it's just this inherent belief that the Anglo-Saxon race was superior and that other races needed to be more civilized by those that were more advanced. Now, did the average American necessarily was influenced by that? No. But not everybody in power, but there was some individuals in power who did think that way. And really, it was used by the British or the Germans and others to justify their empire, much more so than the United States did. Really, what's driving the United States expansion is desire for new markets and new natural resources, this idea of wanting to extend the American frontier from Frederick Jackson Turner's significance of the frontier in American history, his thesis about the frontier had always been a part of American history, and so forth. So that's really what's driving American expansion. Now, the Spanish-American War, of all the wars the United States has fought in, has been the shortest, and it's really easy to understand the causes. Okay, three simple causes, and then some simple effects as well. So the simple causes are yellow journalism, okay, the sinking of the USS Maine, was an American vessel, and then this one, the third one, was a lesser of the two, but kind of added to the fuel of the fire, and so to speak, and that's the DeLome letter. So, but let's give the backstory of what happens in Cuba. Now, by the 1890s, there's just very, very few places in the Western Hemisphere that has not got their independence from a European country. Cuba being one, Puerto Rico being another, and then the British and French Guianas and the northeast part of South America. The last two places in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery were actually Cuba and Brazil. Cuba did it in the early 1880s, and Brazil did it in like either 1887, 1888 time frame. So there was a movement among local Cubans for nationalism. They wanted their independent country. So they were hoping that Spain would give it to them, but they kept pushing and pushing. Spain was like, no, no, no. Because still Cuba was profitable from sugar, like it had been the colonial time period. If you've had me for U.S. History 1 or have taken U.S. History 1, you should know about the importance of the sugar cultivation in the Caribbean. So by the mid-1890s, they began resorting to various tactics to try to get Spain to get their independence. For one thing is they burned the sugar crops. Spain responded by sending in this ruthless general named Valeriano Wheeler. They called him Bloody Wheeler, and he rounded up a lot of the Cuban nationalists and put them in these concentration camps. Now, when I'm talking about concentration camps, I'm not talking about the Nazi death camps of World War II, like Birkenau or Majdanek or something like that. But what I am talking about is holding camps and so forth, and that's where they were kept in these like holding prisons. So to understand why the United States would get involved with that, you have to understand yellow journalism at the time. So there was a newspaper owner by the name of Joseph Pulitzer, with the Pulitzer Prize is named after, and he owned the New York World newspaper. It was one of the most widely read newspapers in the country, and he popularized a journalism style known as yellow journalism. So much so that William Randolph Hearst ended up becoming one of his rivals, who owned a San Francisco newspaper and later owned one in New York as well. When he bought it, kind of emulated what Joseph Pulitzer had done. So let me explain what yellow journalism is. It's where you take some truth and then you exaggerate and expand on it to create sensationalist news. We see this all the time right now in the 24/7 news media. That is, a lot of it is sensationalist news. They take a story and they put like a powerful headline to draw your attention, to draw you in this case, to buy the newspaper for the day. So because I'll have newspaper boys or newsies around cities trying to get people to buy the local newspaper, and they would use headlines on the front page to draw you in. Oh, that sounds like an interesting story. Let me get a copy of that. And so both Pulitzer and Hearst favored American expansion. Okay, they wanted the United States to get involved in foreign affairs. They wanted the United States to expand to new frontiers and new markets. They wanted the United States to, get involved with imperialism in the world. So they were hoping that Cuba would might be the spark to the United States expansion into the Caribbean. And so Hearst was known to have said, "You give me a picture and I'll give you a war." Like, he had sent some journalists down there to take pictures of what was happening to these Cuban nationalists in these concentration camps or these holding camps. And so, yes, were the Spanish brutal to the Cubans? Yes. Were they as bad as maybe the newspaper actually made it out to be? Probably not. Okay. Now, another thing that was a cause of the Spanish-American War is what's called the de Lome letter. Now, there was a Spanish ambassador to the United States called Dupe de Lome, who at the time wrote something that one of it was either the New York World or Hearst's newspaper kind of had either stolen or paid off somebody to get this information. But basically, in that thing that was released and they published it, they insulted the American president. Okay, this is back before Watergate, when Americans were distrustful at times of politicians. So they called, he called William McKinley, the president of the United States at the time, an ear to the ground politician. Basically, like, he didn't really know what to do, didn't know the difference between come here and sick him, and he just kind of listened to the whims of the people. Okay, so it was basically insulting our president. So there was all this different conflict that was emerging in Cuba. President McKinley had sent a U.S. vessel down to Cuba to get out American citizens out of harm's way and out of danger. And this is pretty common throughout all the way to present day. If there's ever a country that is having turmoil, a lot of times U.S. will send in small military forces to get our citizens out, so they're not killed and so forth. Like, try to get them out of the U.S. embassy or whatnot. So this is standard procedure. But what ends up happening is in Havana Harbor, the USS Maine explodes. Now, so the question is, what caused the explosion? Now, there's really a couple different options. It was an internal explosion, so that means there was something wrong with the boiler in the ship, which actually is what actually happened. We discovered that in 1970s, whenever they did an excavation on it out of Havana Harbor. Or was it a Spanish mine? So if you're a yellow journalist newspaper, what's going to sell more papers? An American ship was blown up by a foreign country's mine that we're having issues with, or about internal explosion? Well, of course, it's going to be the mine. And so they didn't care so much about the truth, the way that they publish. I'll show you the front page of one of the newspapers here in just a minute. And so once that happens, McKinley goes to Congress and asks for a declaration of war. Now, the reason why McKinley did that is because the majority of Americans favored war. Yellow journalists had kind of had appealed to American motions for several months and even over a year to get more Americans on favor of supporting Cuban independence. They really particularly made it out to be like the Cubans pushing for independence, or like the Americans, patriots pushing for independence against the British back in the 1770s. So now you have some factions in Congress who are like, we don't need new territories. And so they said, all right, we'll declare war if we're just fighting to give Cuba its independence, and we're not going to try to capture Cuba when the war is over. So the Teller Amendment was ratified in Congress. So we're going to tell you that we're not going to annex you. And war gets declared in April 17, 1898. Doesn't last very long. Lasted just over 100 days. A couple different battles take place, and then the U.S. wins. So the Cuban nationalist movement is called the Cuba Libre, if you ever see that in a textbook and so forth. And here's Joseph Pulitzer on the left, William Randolph Hearst on the right, who really, Pulitzer created yellow journalism and Hearst emulated it, and owned two of the biggest newspaper in the country, and extremely wealthy individual. In fact, Hearst's either daughter or granddaughter ends up becoming a bank robber later in the 20th century. So this is a political cartoon in one of their newspapers. And so it's like the Cuba Libre movement is in a frying pan, and and basically they're like a damsel in distress. And so you can't let them jump out of the frying pan into anarchy, but they're also burning. And so the United States needs to come in and save them. Okay. The duty of the hour to save her not only from Spain, but from a worse fate. You can see that at the bottom. All right. So anyway, yellow journalism, you exaggerate the truth, sensationalist news. Okay. We just think of 24/7 news media today, and you got some of the yellow journalism. So whatever's going to get the most viewers, the most ads, makes the most money. And so yellow journalism is a big one. Also, Americans admire the jingoism of the Cubans. Now, jingoism is extreme nationalism, extreme patriotism. Grover Cleveland, before McKinley was the president, was like, nah, no, I don't think we want to do this. He also didn't want to annex Hawaii either. But McKinley comes in. He's like, well, these poor Cubans, they're just trying to get independence. And so Hearst had printed the DeLome letter, and then the sinking of the Maine happened. And so I always tell kids or students I've had in the past, there's a little rhyme you can remember. The sinking of the Maine gets blamed on Spain, or the battle cry was, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, and so forth. So the sinking of the Maine gets blamed on Spain. Okay. So McKinley asks Contra Declaration of War, and they give it. Here's the USS Maine before it explodes. And that's what it looks like afterwards. Over 200 American sailors lost their life, which is tragic. So this is from Hearst's newspaper, The World. Main explosion caused by a bomb or a torpedo. Okay. Did you ever see in the title that any kind of internal explosion is an option? It's because there's not. That didn't fit their narrative. Okay. So you see also American sailors are going flying in the air and so forth. Here's another one. Here's a political cartoon that came out this time. So it portrayed Spain as this nasty brute who just stabbed and murdered Americans. Obviously, that's got a bias in the point of view. And so, talk about the Teller Amendment, prevents the United States from annexing Cuba. The United States does get a little strip of territory called Guantanamo Bay at the end of that. So, really, in terms of the naval side of the war, it's like showing up to a gang fight and your gang didn't show. Spain showed up with a wooden navy. The United States has got a modern navy made out of steel. Okay, that is like showing up to a gang fight and your gang didn't show. You're going to lose. So the United States Navy crushes the Spanish Navy in Havana Harbor. But what's interesting, and this is kind of a fascinating story in American history, and something that he didn't have the authority to do. My favorite president, Teddy Roosevelt, was assistant to the Secretary of the Navy. So he wasn't even the Secretary of the Navy; he was just the assistant. When the war gets declared, he sent off a telegram, okay, without his boss's approval, to the United States naval admiral who had some ships that were on this little tour, and they were in Hong Kong at the time, and said, hey, if you can capture Manila Bay in the Philippines, which was a Spanish colony and had been a Spanish colony since the 1500s, then capture it. So one of the things that Admiral Dewey did was he recruited a Philippine insurrectionist who had been exiled into Hong Kong, a guy named Emilio Aguinaldo, and he picks him up before he goes to Manila. And Dewey sails down to Manila Bay and meets the Spanish fleet and destroys them. Now, he's got a few ships. He can't capture a large island network like the Philippines. And so he releases Emilio Aguinaldo and sends him to start an insurrection against the Spanish. And now their navy has been defeated. The Spanish confidence is messed up. Teddy Roosevelt, after he sends that telegram, he immediately resigns, so he can't be punished, and then joins an elite cavalry unit known as the Rough Riders, led by Leonard Wood. And they recruited these rough and tumble cowboys across the country. And it's kind of supposed to be this elite cavalry unit. It's a kind of a fascinating American military unit in our history. And their unit, along with two all-black regiments on each side of their flank, stormed up San Juan Hill. Actually, it was a nearby hill, but kind of like Bunker Hill. We named it San Juan Hill, even though it wasn't the correct hill. And they were able to capture the hill, even though you don't typically attack uphill, but they did. And the Rough Riders get really a ton of credit in the press. But in American history, let's give credit where credit is due. Were the Rough Riders very brave? Absolutely. But the two all-black regiments on each side of their flanks were just as much important. In fact, the Rough Riders would have been annihilated by the Spanish forces who were entrenched on high ground if it wasn't for the all-black regiments on each side of their flanks. And so it's really a three-prong attack that leads to the success of San Juan Hill. So let's give credit where credit is due. All three units deserve a lot of credit for bravery and were instrumental in the success at San Juan Hill. Teddy Roosevelt helped lead the charge, and actually gets awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. He's the only American president to ever be awarded the Medal of Honor. He was awarded it. He died in 1920, but he gets awarded it during World War II randomly, probably because of his popularity, but certainly should have been decorated. So anyway, there's Manila, where Admiral Dewey captures the bay. He doesn't capture the Philippines, okay? And then the United States attacks, actually, out of Santiago Harbor. That's where the Navy went. I think I said Havana. Havana is where the USS Maine gets destroyed. You can see at the bottom image here where San Juan Hill is, and El County and Kettle Hill and so forth, where the United States is victorious. So there's Dewey, who rocked an amazing mustache back in the day. And he captured Manila Bay and then released Emilio Aguinaldo to help create an insurrection. So look at this, New York World, Dewey smashes Spain's fleet and so forth. So that's sensationalist news, okay? Did he mention that we had a steel Navy and they had a wooden Navy? No, okay? So this is a painting of Rough Riders going up San Juan Hill. Okay, you can tell from this charge up San Juan Hill, you notice there's several units that attack, and Teddy Roosevelt's unit got a lot of press, but it is a three-prong attack. This is another. They weren't riding up San Juan Hill; they were marched up San Juan Hill. This is an actual picture taken at near San Juan Hill, and here's Rough Riders. Here's Teddy Roosevelt right here in the middle with the classes. But they really were actual real life tough cowboys, and they do deserve some credit for their bravery on San Juan Hill. But we can't forget the all black regiments that played just as equally important of a role in that charge, and so forth. And this is the all black regiments, a painting of them. Notice they've got white officers. We don't integrate the United States military, the armed forces, until 1948 when Harry S. Truman integrates the military. That shows you the prejudice of the day. Now, so war ends pretty quickly after about a little over 100 days. Spain's like, all right, we can't do this. So the United States agrees to accept their surrender as long as Cuba gets independence, which does happen. And then the United States pays $20 million for some new territory. So here's the three territories the United States gets. The Philippines, which become an independent country in 1946. Guam, which is still a U.S. territory today, and they can vote in presidential elections and have a naval base there. And then Puerto Rico, which has voted a few times about statehood. And the most recent time, just a few years ago, they came very close to becoming the 51st state. I say bring them in, but because they're U.S. citizens and get to vote presidential elections, they just don't have representation in Congress. One of the reasons why they haven't is because of the income tax would increase for them becoming a state. So anyway, but during the war, McKinley ends up annexing Hawaii because he gets influenced to do this because arguing that we need a naval base on the way to the Philippines after Dewey kind of captures the Philippines with Emilio Aguinaldo's help. And so Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines all get annexed and bought for $20 million from Spain. Now, the only one that's controversial is really the Philippines because they legitimately don't want to be annexed by the United States. The Philippines have been wanting independence from Spain for quite some time, and we don't give it to them until after World War II. I suppose we were going to give it to them sooner, but Japan ruthlessly invades the Philippine Islands in 1941, and that kind of ends that until 1946. The Philippines fight very bravely against the Japanese on behalf of the United States during World War II and deserve a lot of credit. So in 1900, 2 years after the war ends, the Congress passes the Foraker Act, which sets up a civil government in Puerto Rico. In 1917, we made Puerto Ricans U.S. citizens. Now, Puerto Rico ends up sending quite a few immigrants in American history to particularly the Northeast, New York. So if you've ever seen the famous musical West Side Story. It's actually one of the groups in the story is actually a Puerto Rican gang. There's a ton of Puerto Ricans that come to New York, also Florida as well. And so McKinley ends up installing a military government in all those places. Cuba drafts a constitution in 1900, but it didn't want U.S. involvement. So the U.S. involvement, because we're basically like, hey, we helped you get your independence. You wouldn't have independence without us. The United States adopts what's called a Platt Amendment that said, look, we can intervene in Cuba if it is deemed necessary. Okay, and there's a couple times in U.S. history the United States has intervened because Cuba has had some insurrection problems, and in fact, Teddy Roosevelt had to send some troops down there. He was not happy about it. He didn't want to actually do that, but to prevent anarchy from erupting. So eventually, FDR gets rid of it in 1934 with the good neighbor policy when he starts being a quote unquote good neighbor to Latin America. Herbert Hoover started it, and then FDR kind of made it famous. So this is Uncle Sam's latest, greatest, shortest war in one of the local magazines. So let's talk about the divide now in our country right after the Spanish-American War, and that is the battle between imperialism and anti-imperialism. So the anti-imperialist, basically, these were conservatives of the day that believed the Constitution did not give the federal government power to acquire territory to be held and governed permanently as colonies. The anti-imperialists did not want to make 8 million Filipino citizens either. Leading citizens enlisted in the anti-imperialist cause, including the Steel King Andrew Carnegie, who offered a check for $20 million to purchase the independence of the Philippines. That's about what the United States paid for that, and Guam and Puerto Rico, and they don't accept it. The labor leader Samuel Gompers, who feared the competition of cheap Filipino labor, was also an anti-imperialist. And then Jane Addams, the famous Settlement House movement leader we talked about in Module 1, was an anti-imperialist. She believed that women across the globe should stand for peace. And in November of 1898, Boston Group formed the first of the anti-imperialist leagues that began to spring up around the country. William James Bryan, famous presidential candidate in 1896, 1900, 1908, all stood for anti-imperialism. And anyway, but he was anti-imperialist, but even voted for the ratification of the treaty. Now, I will say this about Bryan: if he would have ran on strictly an anti-imperialist ticket in 1900, he might have beat McKinley. It's certainly possible, but he makes silver the issue and ends up losing. But what ends up happening is after the United States crushes Spain in the Spanish-American War, the United States is now seen as a world power. Now, here's some arguments, primary sources that I want you to read at some point. We're not going to do this in a recorded lecture, but you can print these off or download them and read them. Now, this is kind of an interesting prediction. British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury at the time said that Britain, Spain, and China were the dying powers in the world. Now, if you remember, Britain was dominant in the 17 and 1800s. Really, the height of the British Empire was in the 1800s. Spain was tremendously dominant in the 15 and 1600s until they experienced inflation and the defeat of the Spanish Armada and so forth. China was one of the great world powers of world history. I mean, and this is actually probably their weakest time in their history. Now, in the 20th century, China's going to reinvent itself behind communism and they'll eventually become a world power again. But what he called the living powers, or those that are rising to prominence, he said the United States, Germany, and Japan. Now, he was spot on with that prediction. The U.S. becomes a world power, ends up becoming victorious in World War I and World War II. Germany could have won World War I and could have won World War II if it wasn't for a couple of missteps, but they were certainly on the rise. And Japan is going to be a force to be reckoned with until the United States ends up having to put old-fashioned, as my dad would say, Jap slapping on Japan during World War II. Really, it's because we can outproduce them and then bomb them. And we're more advanced in technology that allows the United States to beat Japan. But Japan was a heck of a foe during World War II and really beat the snot out of us for the first 6 months of World War II. So here is Emilio Aguinaldo. Now, what's interesting about the Spanish-American War is the fact that we hardly lose any men fighting the thing. It's really more from malaria. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt and almost all the Rough Riders and the all-black regiments that fought in Cuba suffered from malaria, and they suffered from malaria off and on throughout their lives. And so Emilio Aguinaldo, once Spain sells the Philippines to the United States, immediately said, hey, will the United States, will you give us independence? And they're like, no. So he begins leading an insurrection against the U.S. And ironically, the U.S. loses far more troops putting down the Philippine insurrection than they did fighting actually against Spain. And one of the commanders there in the Philippines, who later, I think, either gets court-martialed or almost gets court-martialed, he ends up getting fired for sure, had began rounding up the Philippine insurrectionists and putting them in concentration camps like Bloody Wheeler had for the Cuba Libre nationalist movement. So it's bad, and it's a PR nightmare, and a lot of American troops are dying of malaria as well, and just doing what they were told. So anyway, but Emilio Aguinaldo eventually gets captured, agrees to stop fighting, and the United States promises to eventually give the Philippines citizenship. Okay, so this is estimated, but they estimate just over 4,000 American troops are killed, and about 16,000 Filipino soldiers are killed. So Aguinaldo in 1901 pledges allegiance to the U.S., and the war ends. So they don't get independence until 1946, after World War II. Here are some American soldiers there, very hot in the Philippines, and American troops are going to have even greater difficulty recapturing the Philippine Islands from the Japanese in 1944, 1945. So this is the Anti-Imperialist League political cartoon showing all the Filipinos dying from the insurrection. Here's another one. So election 1900, McKinley is going to win a lot easier against William Jennings Bryan because Bryan makes silver the issue yet again, just like he did in 1896, and this ends up being his downfall in election 1900. Okay, so here's Bryan, and this one's making fun of Bryan. Look how small and young he looks, and this is actually making fun of the anti-imperialist. So debate is, what should we do with the territories? Should the Filipinos be given citizenship? Okay, so the Supreme Court said that Congress had the ability to decide, but U.S. law did not apply in foreign territories. Hence, some of those commanders can be brought to justice. And so we talked about the Platt Amendment, gave the United States the right to intervene. And then Jones Act in 1916 to appease the Philippines said, look, we're going to give you independence at a future date. And then it gave Puerto Rican citizenship. Okay. Now we will come to Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson's foreign policy in part 4.